Asif apologized for not having a book. I apologize for having an autobiography, which is quite hard to lecture on. You can't lecture on yourself. So what I've got is a few little vignettes of readings, which I'm going to string together. The second volume, Brief Candle in the Dark, is not written chronologically. The first one, An Appetite for Wonder, is a straightforward chronological account of my childhood and school days and so on up to the age of 35 and publication of The Selfish Gene. The second one is not chronological, it's thematic. And I'm going to pick out one or two of the themes and introduce readings about each of the themes. My career has been an Oxford Don, teaching zoology, and then later Professor of the Public Understanding of Science. And I was a Fellow of New College all that time, and the first reading is about that. I have great affection for New College and for many friends made there over years. Yes, we have our share of scholarly prima donnas, clever, but not necessarily as clever as their vanity persuades them. And we have the reverse, a scholar so lacking in vanity, a scholar so lacking in vanity as laughingly to tell at lunch a story like this against himself. I was telephoned by the student newspaper today. Dr. So-and-so, have you any comment on the fact that in your lecture this morning, one of the students yawned so vigorously that he dislocated his jaw? As it happens, the same student newspaper, Charwell, once telephoned me when it was doing a survey of dons to see how cool we were. The student reporter put to me a list of questions to assess my street cred, such as, what is the price of a packet of Durex? And then, what is the price of a Big Mac? To which, in my naivety, I replied, oh, about £2,000, the colour screen. Another of the themes which the book covers is when I was invited to give the Christmas lectures at the Royal Institution. This was a wonderful idea started by Michael Faraday, I think in the 1820s. It's a series of 5 lectures given to children around about Christmas time, and in recent years, the 5 lectures have been televised. I regarded it as a great honor and a very frightening one to be invited to do this. The precedents were such wonderful people as David Attenborough and Carl Sagan. So amid great trepidation, I agreed to do it. There's a tradition in the Christmas lectures that you don't show slides, or you show very few slides. You do demonstrations, hands-on demonstrations, and children are called up onto the stage, rather like a conjurer, calling up people in the audience. So you get the idea that during this 1 year that I spent preparing the Christmas lectures, I got thoroughly demonstration-minded, thoroughly used to the idea of calling people up to assist with a demonstration. In one lecture, the 5th lecture, I was talking about something about eyes, and I said that the really crucial experiment to test the theory that I was proposing was to inject somebody's eye with an anesthetic to prevent them from moving their eye. So I was going to inject an eye. This being the Christmas lectures, the next thing to do was to call for a volunteer. I produced a huge veterinary hypodermic syringe fit to sedate a rhinoceros and asked, who would like to take part in the experiment? Normally, the children at the Royal Institution lectures fall over themselves in their eagerness to assist in demonstrations. Surely nobody would volunteer in this case. And I was about to reassure everyone that it was only a joke when one little girl of 7, probably the youngest in the audience, hesitantly raised her hand. It was my darling daughter Juliet, sitting shyly by her mother. I still choke up a little at the memory of her uncomprehending loyalty and courage in the face of the monstrous hypodermic that I was brandishing. Is it irrelevant that she is now a promising young doctor? There's quite a lot in the book of just anecdotes about people that I've known, many scientists. I was very fortunate to get a named endowed professorship, the Charles Simonyi Professorship of the Public Understanding of Science. I was the first holder of it. And in honor of Charles Simonyi, the benefactor, I endowed myself an annual series of lectures called the Charles Simonyi Lectures. And these were in public understanding of science, and I invited some really rather distinguished scientists to come and talk to a lay audience. And I'm going to read a couple of anecdotes about two of them. First, Richard Leakey, the well-known paleoanthropologist who's discovered so many of the fossils of our history, and he's also a heroic conservationist. He pilots his own plane in Africa, and he had a crash in which he lost both his legs. His plane crashed the day after it was serviced, at a time when he was extremely unpopular in certain influential circles in Kenya, and you can draw from that what conclusions you like. Richard tells a lovely, if slightly macabre, story about his legs. After they were amputated in Cambridge, he wanted, for sentimental reasons, to bury them in his beloved Kenya. He had to get permission to transport them, and bureaucracy insisted that this was possible only if he could produce a death certificate. He very reasonably argued that he wasn't dead, and eventually the Dundridges saw the justice of this and agreed. They stipulated, however, that he must take them in his hand luggage. Legs may not be checked in. Richard hilariously describes the double take of the previously bored official watching the X-ray screen as the bag containing the legs went through, and his facial expression as he frantically beckoned his colleagues to come over. And the second anecdote, I altogether invited 10 lecturers. I'm just reading about two of them. Carolyn Porco is, to me, she's the female Carl Sagan. She's in charge of the Cassini project, which is the team that brings back those fantastic images that you see of Saturn and its satellites. And she is, well, I described her as a poet of the planets and a singer of the stars. An anecdote displays the poetry of Carolyn, and I related it in the Oxford Playhouse when introducing her Simonyi lecture. A beloved professor from her days at Caltech was the geologist Eugene Shoemaker, co-discoverer with his wife and David Levy of the famous Shoemaker-Levy comet. A pioneer of astrogeology, Shoemaker was part of the Apollo space program. He was in the running to be the first geologist on the moon, but to his sad regret had to drop out for health reasons. And he turned to training astronauts instead of being one. In 1997, Shoemaker was killed in a car crash in Australia. Carolyn, in her grief, raced into action. She knew that NASA was about to launch an unmanned craft which was programmed to crash land on the moon after its mission was accomplished. She managed to persuade the mission manager, as well as the head of the planetary exploration program at NASA, to add her teacher's ashes to the spacecraft's payload. Gene Shoemaker's ambition to be an astronaut was denied him in life, but his ashes now lie on the moon's surface, where no wind stirs them. It is said that Neil Armstrong's footprints are almost certainly still intact. Carolyn included a photographic engraving bearing these words from Romeo and Juliet. "And when he shall die, take him and cut him out in little stars, and he will make the face of heaven so fine that all the world will be in love with night and pay no worship to the garish sun." There's another section on Japan and various travels that I'd been on, and this one is about the giant squid. I'd become friendly with Ray Dalio, brilliant financier and enthusiast for science. In pursuit of his passion for marine biology, he had bought a beautiful research vessel, the Alucia, and had now teamed up with 2 television companies, one in Japan and one in America, in a search for the giant squid, fabled sea monster of yore, in the deep seas off Japan. He invited me along amid the utmost secrecy because the television companies, in the event that they found a giant squid, wanted to save the news up for maximum impact. Unfortunately, that trip was postponed. I forgot about it and went about my normal business. Then, some months later, in the summer of 2012, I received a telephone call out of the blue. It was Ray. Characteristically, he didn't beat about the bush. "Can you get on a plane to Japan tomorrow?" "Why, have you found the giant squid?" "I am not at liberty to say." "Right, I'll be there." And I was, although it wasn't literally the next day, more like a week. I still didn't officially know that they'd found a giant squid, and I scrupulously kept silent about the suspected reason for my precipitate summons. Only Lala, my wife, knew why I had flown so suddenly to Japan, and she too maintained strict secrecy. To no avail, at least on one occasion. She met David Attenborough at a social event, and he asked after me. Lala replied that I was on a ship in Japanese waters. "Oh," said Sir David without hesitation, "he's obviously after the giant squid." So much for our careful reticence. There are moments of sentiment in the book for which I suppose I ought to apologize, but damn it, I'm not going to. This is about a beloved dog from my childhood, actually. And there are various stories about this dog. His name was Bunch. My father was very scientifically minded and loved to keep records of weather. So he had a rain gauge in which he measured scrupulously, religiously, every day he measured the day's rainfall and kept records for many decades, at least until Bunch, the dog, was caught peeing into the rain gauge. Indulge me in a shameless moment of sentiment. Looking this week through a tattered folder of poems that my parents collected for each other over many years, painstakingly copied out by hand, I found the following in my mother's handwriting, obviously written immediately after the death of Bunch. It is unfinished, as can be seen from the crossings out and corrections, but I think it is beautiful enough to be reproduced here. And if you can't be sentimental in an autobiography, when can you? Dear little ghost of happiness, who lopes beside me down the years, no dog of flesh and blood will take your place, nor ever stem the tears that come unbidden from the heart. For you were very part of me, and all the fields and all the ways down woodland ride or open hill are empty places now for me. You are not there. You are not there. Dear Bunch, it's all nonsense to say you can't miss a dog as much as a person. Or to put it another way, for purposes of mourning, a dog can become a person. Now, my best-selling book is actually not The Selfish Gene, it's The God Delusion. And it is controversial in some areas. It's often described as strident and shrill. One critic even accused me of Tourette's syndrome. And the last two readings relate to this. Here's an example of the kind of thing in the God Delusion to which I suspect critics take exception as savage or strident, aggressive or offensive, but which I see as good-natured satire. A touch of the stiletto, perhaps, but miles away from the bludgeon or from vulgar abuse. After pointing out that Roman Catholicism, though avowedly monotheistic, has leanings towards polytheism, with the Virgin Mary a goddess in all but name, and the saints attracting personal supplication as demigods, each in his own specialist field of expertise, I continued, Pope John Paul II created more saints than all his predecessors of the past several centuries put together, and he had a special affinity with the Virgin Mary. His polytheistic hankerings were dramatically demonstrated in 1981 when he suffered an assassination attempt in Rome and attributed his survival to intervention by Our Lady of Fatima. A maternal hand guided the bullet. One cannot help wondering why she didn't guide it to miss him altogether. Others might think the team of surgeons who operated on him for 6 hours deserved at least a share of the credit. But perhaps their hands too were maternally guided. The relevant point is that it wasn't just Our Lady who, in the Pope's opinion, guided the bullet, but specifically Our Lady of Fatima. Presumably Our Lady of Lourdes, Our Lady of Guadalupe, Our Lady of Medjugorje, Our Lady of Akita, Our Lady of Zaitun, Our Lady of Garabandal, and Our Lady of Knock were busy on other errands at the time. But The God Delusion is mostly a very gentle book. The beginning and the end are extremely gentle. I'm just to read this last bit about the beginning of the book. The beginning of the book is a generous reminiscence about a chaplain at my old school who, as a boy, was lying with his face in the grass and was inspired by a moment of revelation to embrace the religion which was to become his life's path. Suddenly, the microforest of the turf seemed to swell and become one with the universe and with the rapt mind of the boy contemplating it. I respected his epiphany enough to say that, in another time and place, that boy could have been me under the stars, dazzled by Orion, Cassiopeia, and Ursa Major, tearful with the unheard music of the Milky Way, heady with the night scents of frangipani and trumpet flowers in an African garden. The reference to Ursa Major was consciously prompted by the memory of a poem written by my mother as a girl, which concluded with the following lines. The great bear stands upon his head, his paws among the apple boughs that, dark against a darker sky, wave in the wind and tap their twigs with little sounds forlorn and sad within the night's dark emptiness. My opening page ended with a warmly indulgent reminiscence of how we used to distract our chaplain in divinity lessons by asking him to recall his wartime service in the RAF. And I quoted in his honor John Betjeman's gently affectionate poem, Our Padre. Our Padre is an old sky pilot. Severely now they've clipped his wings, but still the flagstaff in the rectory garden points to higher things. After my book was published, I was delighted when an old boy of the same school sent a little poem in to my website, richarddawkins.net. I knew your flying chaplain. As my housemaster I oughter. While you embraced his liberal views, I just embraced his daughter. Whatever the faults of a British private school education, Oundle must have something going for it if it produces alumni who can turn out that sort of thing.